This game studio tried to sue their own players for $18 million, and to a lot of people, they're like the boogeyman of the gaming industry, because their entire brand revolved around mass-releasing shovelware games, harassing anybody who would dare criticize their work, and being so litigious that it made Nintendo's lawyers seem normal. They really were just outright a horrible company from start to finish, and even though it's been a few years since Valve finally stepped in and removed their entire library of games from the Steam store page, people to this day still talk about Digital Homicide Studios, especially when they're debating who was the worst indie studio of all time. And well, today we're going to talk about them because I found out that some of their games are still up on itch.io, but first let me take you back to the Wild West of the gaming industry in the early 2010s, where indie games were almost seen like a brand new gold rush, because you had Minecraft exploding in popularity, games like Super Meat Boy and Amnesia were being released, you know, these childhood-defining games for a lot of people, and it was a time where small developers were first getting the taste of what it was like to upload a passion project onto Steam and start raking in millions of dollars. This was back when the Steam Greenlight program still existed, and because of it, it was actually pretty easy to accidentally stumble into some really cool, amazing new indie games, especially since the players at the time really just loved browsing the Steam store page looking for hidden gems. But while you had some legit developers making some really standout titles like No More Room in Hell and Project Zomboid, for example, well, there was also a lot of them who tried to exploit the program and gamify it so that way they could flood the Steam store page with actual junk. And this is where two brothers came in named James and Robert Romine from Yuma, Arizona, and they decided that they wanted to capitalize on this hot new trend of indie gaming. So together they founded Digital Homicide Studios, one of the most infamous names in the gaming industry. And the reason for that is because they weren't really dreaming of coming up with the next Hollow Knight or releasing like the next Stardew Valley or anything like that. No, their game plan was to rapidly create as many indie games as possible to try to scam any unsuspecting players that might accidentally stumble into their games on the Steam store page. And the way that they got away with this initially was actually by abusing the Steam Greenlight program. So the way that the Greenlight program worked was that there was a community voting system where the players decided which games they wanted to see added into the platform. So for the developers, there was a $100 submission fee, but it was the perfect way to get your game out there for people who just didn't have access to a traditional publisher, and it was a way for the community themselves to feel like they were more involved and, you know, they just had a real impact of what kind of game gets added to the Steam store page. So what Digital Homicide Studios would do is that they would just put up an okay looking submission on the Steam Greenlight for their games, so that way they could make it seem like it was more than what they really were. And what they did is that they would promise to give away keys for other games like Ark Survival Evolved and Rocket League, for example, in exchange for approval votes. And they would also say that if their project actually did end up getting greenlit, they would also give away a bunch of keys for their games too, which not only violated the Steam Greenlight guidelines, but this also meant that we had a mountain of shovelware games getting pushed to the Steam store page that players thought were good enough to get greenlit by a positive rating. So starting from 2014, Digital Homicide Studios just went crazy, flooding Greenlight with a bunch of lazy, poorly designed asset flips like the Slaughtering Grounds, Galactic Hitman, Temper Tantrum, you know, the kind of stuff that makes you wonder if the developers themselves even played them to see if they were functional at least. One of their biggest ones was called the Slaughtering Grounds, like I mentioned. It was a first-person shooter game where you had to shoot zombies and survive for a total of 16 minutes and 16 seconds to complete a level. There was 3 levels total, but like there wasn't any other objective other than to just shoot zombies with a very limited amount of ammo and then just wait for time to pass. This was the first game I played from them, and it was just comically terrible. Like the zombies would just stand around waiting for you to approach them. There was a huge issue with not finding enough ammo, and like I mentioned, you just end up running around non-stop waiting for time to pass. You really just were not enjoying yourself at all playing this game. Like, it was just so poorly designed. At like the 15 to 20 minute mark of me playing the game, my chat was already begging me to turn it off. It was just horrible. The funny part about the Slaughtering Grounds is that Digital Homicide didn't actually release it under their own name. You know, they didn't want people to associate such a terrible game with their actual company, so they originally uploaded it under the nickname Imminent Uprising. And for a lot of the future games that they would end up releasing, they also just kept changing it up, going by names like Microstrategic Game Designs, EEC Games, you know, just trying to make it as difficult as possible for players to connect the dots and find out who really was behind all these terrible games being posted. That was the first layer. The second layer that Digital Homicide was going for was that they were managing to gamify the system after the players would start catching on and just completely destroy them on the Steam reviews. People would still give them a shot anyways, and the way that this happened is that Digital Homicide would start bundling their games on Steam, and then the players would collect the Steam trading cards that they would get for playing the games. And the funny funny part is that the Steam trading cards were worth more than the actual game itself, so people would just buy the games and it would just be like a profitable money-making method. Not a very good one, but still you were technically making money by playing Digital Homicide games, and well, since Digital Homicide would get a kickback for every card that was sold, they were also making money there. And it got to the point where they were giving away tens of thousands of free copies of their games, hoping to scrape every last penny that they could from the Steam trading card marketplace. But now the real downfall of Digital Homicide Studios began when a popular YouTube critic called Jim Sterling uploaded a first impressions video playing the Slaughtering Grounds and calling it the new worst game of 2014. And if you look at the gameplay now, you can immediately tell how terrible and empty the Slaughtering Grounds really was, so anybody with a sense of reason could just tell you that the critiques in the video were 100% justified. But you have to understand something though, that Digital Homicide Studios, they did not respond well to criticism whatsoever. Like, the Romine brothers had a history of trying to censor critics on Steam and harassing anybody who dared call out how broken their games really were. So seeing Jim Sterling calling their game trash online was enough for them to respond. So what they did is that they re-uploaded Sterling's video on their own YouTube channel in a Review the Reviewer style series, calling Sterling a bunch of different insults. Then Sterling decided to respond by re-uploading the re-upload to add commentary on top of that and start dunking on them for how ridiculous the Romine brothers were being. But then the Romine brothers responded by doubling down and explaining that asset flipping was just important for their development cycles. Like, this back and forth went on for a really long time until James Romine decided to eventually sue Jim Sterling in the Arizona District Court for $15 million. Digital Homicide Studios was claiming that Sterling's videos caused emotional distress, they killed video game sales. Now obviously this lawsuit was more about them trying to silence criticism, not really about whatever was being claimed, and well, the suit ended up getting dismissed in 2017, but it was basically setting a precedent of what you could expect from Digital Homicide Studios in the future. Eventually though, people got tired of dealing with all the shovelware crap that was getting pushed to the Steam Greenlight program, and they started connecting the dots of who exactly was the company behind all these asset flips that kept getting posted under a bunch of fake names. And there was a group that was formed called the Digital Homicides that was specifically made to call these types of developers out that kept abusing the Steam Greenlight system. So by 2016, Digital Homicide's games were getting blasted into oblivion with negative reviews, and pretty much everybody was just savvy of their terrible business practices. They kept posting the same games on Greenlight over and over again, hoping that they'd get approved, and they just kept getting reported and taken down because people were just, they were smarter than that at that point. But it got to the point where on September of 2016, James Romine sued 100 anonymous Steam users for $18 million. They were claiming harassment, they were claiming stalking, criminal damages, saying that there was an organized group out there hell-bent on destroying their reputation, as if they hadn't already done that to themselves by this point. But they got a subpoena from the court to make Valve reveal the identity of these users, and there was even a GoFundMe that was set up, which only really managed to raise a measly $450. So at this point, because Digital Homicide Studios was now directly targeting users on Steam and urging the platform to reveal sensitive information, Valve was now forced to act. But instead of cooperating with the Romine brothers and the subpoena from the court, they just nuked Digital Homicide from Steam as a response. Valve was just not having it anymore, and they destroyed their little business model by removing every single game from the Steam store page. Digital Homicide Studios was being hostile towards Steam customers, and that was forcing Valve to act. And well, when they took away every single game that the Romine brothers had posted onto Steam, they were kind of just forced to cave because they lost their primary platform for making money. So even though the company threatened to sue Valve after the ban, realistically, they just didn't have the funds to keep up their little legal charade, and they finally went under. Like I mentioned at the beginning of this video, you can still find some of their games on itch.io, and that's where I got the ones that I was playing on stream. But out of all the ones that I tried, I think that maybe Temper Tantrum was the only one that was passable for like the first 5 minutes, because everything else was horrible. Devil's Share was terrible, Wyatt Derp was a trashy game, and like I mentioned, I played the Slaughtering Grounds, Galactic Hitman, there was just a huge list of them. I skipped a lot of them outright because they just kept posting the same game over and over and over again with just like different skins. It was literally the definition of asset flipping. And realistically, I wanted to come here today and tell you guys that I at least found one game that I genuinely enjoyed. I went in looking for one game to see if there was really more to this other than just like mindless asset flipping. Some of them ended up being unintentionally funny, I suppose. It was nice and funny to poke fun at them and criticize them, but to be honest, after playing every single one that I did, It was just mindless, bland, unfinished. I didn't enjoy a single Digital Homicide Studios game. Everything was just frustrating and just not fun at all. So I can go ahead and tell you guys straight up that this company was just beyond redemption. You know, they had one goal: make money. They didn't care about making something enjoyable, something fun. They didn't have the players in mind whatsoever. They literally just wanted to scrape as much money as they could from the players, and that's it. But yeah, if you guys had any sort of encounter with Digital Homicide Studios, feel free to leave a comment. I'll leave a link to the live stream of me playing all the Digihom games, so that way you guys can check it out. And that's all I really wanted to talk about with you guys today. So thank you guys for watching.